Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Omnipod. Take Omnipod Dash out for a spin with a no-commitment free 30-day trial. By Dexcom, take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom. And by Club 1921, where diabetes connections are made.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, when the diabetes community and the Star Trek fandom collide, the actor who brought these groups together spent time as a blue-skinned alien with a lot of prosthetics on Star Trek Discovery, but he had to find a way to reach his fingers for blood sugar checks.
I sort of explained it to him, and they sort of nodded and said, well, it's fine. We'll just put you in gloves the whole time. So the entire time of my sort of run of the show, I am wearing like black leather gloves, regardless of what I'm doing. I'm eating breakfast, I'm wearing black leather gloves. I'm flying a spaceship, I'm wearing black leather gloves. And that was just so I could have easy access to my fingers, so I could test.
That's Noah Averbach-Katz, and while we talk a lot about Star Trek, he's really here to share the news about a movie he's making called Type 1. We've got all the info about the Kickstarter campaign to fund it and other ways you can help. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. Always so glad to have you along. You know we aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. I didn't plan it this way, but it's interesting. This is the second week in a row that we're doing more of a pop culture or media type episode about diabetes, right? We talked about Turning Red last week. If you missed that episode, that is the new Pixar movie on Disney Plus that features two characters with diabetes in the background. And I talked to Susan Fong from Pixar, who made that happen with her whole team, of course. And one of the things that Susan talked about was why it was just fine to have diabetes in the background, right? That's how it is in her life. That's how it is for many people with diabetes. It's not always front and center. It's not always what you want to talk about. But this week's guest looked at things a little differently. As you'll hear, Noah Averbach-Katz wanted to put diabetes front and center and make a movie that didn't feature it in the background. So while I didn't plan, as I said, back to back here, I think it's an interesting contrast. And of course, the other big contrast is that Noah's movie is self-funded. It is on Kickstarter. I am going to link that up right here in the show notes. It'll be at diabetes-connections.com. Very easy to get to. As we are taping, the Kickstarter is still going on, but if you are listening to this after, it is ending. The deadline is March 24th, 2022. And as you'll hear, he's already exceeded his goal, and we'll talk about how that happened. But it doesn't mean that he still doesn't need the money. This movie is expensive. All movies are expensive, and he shares about where the money will go, even as he has exceeded the goal. So if you are so inclined, I will link that up. You can head over there. There's a preview of the movie and more information. Noah was diagnosed with type 1 as a teenager. He will share that story. He's an actor. He has been featured in Star Trek Discovery. That's just one of the parts that he has had. And as he mentioned, he is married to Mary Wiseman, who has a starring role in Star Trek Discovery. When they got married in 2019, the New York Times did a write-up, and I will include that because it's a beautiful story. It's really well written. It's a lot of fun. But I will just share the headline here. A life frequently apart, but an enterprise they'll boldly take on. There's a lot of Star Trek in this family. I do need to warn you, Noah is pretty blunt about diabetes. We all talk about this in different ways, but I would want a heads up if I were listening to this episode with kids. It's not that he's not factual or that he's overly morbid, but when he talks about what can happen, he doesn't pull any punches. So just go into the interview knowing that he's a dry wit, and I didn't want to edit what he had to say, so he's blunt. I talk a little bit about my Star Trek fandom during the interview. I'm going to come back and share some stories about that afterwards. Okay, our conversation in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Omnipod. And I remember years ago when Benny first started on the Animus insulin pump. Yeah, this was a long time ago. An upgrade came out, but we had to wait years to be eligible for it because of insurance requirements. How frustrating is that? I'm so glad things are changing. For example, the Omnipod Promise takes those worries away. With the Omnipod Promise, you can upgrade to Omnipod 5 as soon as it's available to you and covered by insurance, all for no additional upfront cost. Omnipod is available through the pharmacy, which means you won't be tied to a long-term contract. You're free to upgrade at any time. Not to mention, you can pick your pods up right where you pick up your insulin. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Omnipod logo. For full safety risk information and Omnipod Promise terms and conditions, visit omnipod.com/diabetesconnections. Noah, thank you so much for joining me. I think this is going to be a lot of fun.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Let's just jump in and start off the bat. Tell me about this movie. Before I ask you why you wanted to do something like that, tell me what Type 1, what is it?
So Type 1 is essentially a short film about a Type 1 diabetic and his wife who, in the wake of some sort of societal disaster, I mean, really take your pick these days, they sort of go on a journey to kind of find what they hope is a cachet of insulin to keep the guy alive as long as possible. And that's pretty much the thrust of the film.
Is it written? I mean, this is all you, right?
Yes. I, of course, wrote myself in the starring role as diabetic man. So, yes, it's all written. I haven't read it in a really long time, so I'm wondering if it's any good. But I probably should have dipped back in on it before I started the Kickstarter, but it's too late now.
It's one of those things, be careful what you wish for, because,
I
oh my
know.
gosh, it's been so successful.
There's a saying that if you really want to freak an actor out, give them the role. And I definitely feel that these days.
So it doesn't sound like you wrote this too recently. Tell me the story of how it kind of came to you, the idea, and how you started putting it together.
Sure. I was actually doing a play in Baltimore. And in that play, there was a very talented deaf actor named Trishelle Edmonds. And she was gracious enough to sort of let me into the deaf community in a small way, kind of give me some insight on what it means, how important it is, all of the intricacies. There were also, translators and other deaf consultants on this show as well. And it just really got me thinking about the diabetes community and how different it was from the deaf community. In the deaf community, there's so much that is shared between people. There's so much like common, not language, but like common understandings of etiquette and stuff like that. And there are these huge community hubs like Gallaudet University and stuff like that. And in the diabetes community, especially in the Type 1 community, for a lot of reasons, it isn't quite like that. Part of that is, some would say this is debatable, but I generally consider if you choose to be, diabetes can be an invisible illness. So you're not sort of having to survive in the same way that people with other non-invisible disabilities have to do. I felt at the time there was a real lack of media, of things that people in the diabetic community could sort of rally around and have a common thing to talk about other than how they handle their care. Pretty much all of the diabetes representation in the current landscape right now, obviously there's this long list, and some are better than others, and some are like iconically bad, and some are really trying to be hard. But all of them are really for the abled community. They're not really for the disabled community. And there's nothing really wrong with that, especially when the creators or whoever's writing or producing a movie tries really hard to get things right. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think you would be hard pressed for any other diabetics to point to something and say, oh yeah, that is really represents something about my experience. And I can talk about this. This is a launching point for a conversation with other people. And I was sort of in that headspace. And in this play I was playing a dog, and I had these long stretches where I just laid on the floor for like 45 minutes, and I would just sit there thinking, blah, de blah, just random thoughts going through my head. And I sort of thought about this idea, which is, basically the pitch for the movie. And I thought that could be a good idea. That's not a bad idea for a script. And like, it's something that is both narratively exciting and something that I think is a universal experience for Type 1 diabetics, the fear of not being able to get your insulin, whether that's through a natural disaster or whether that's through an institutionally caused lack of access.
Yeah.
And that was in late February of 2020. And then like 5 weeks
gosh.
later, I was sitting in my house in New York being like, well, I think I need to write this down. So for the first 4 or 5 weeks of quarantine in New York, when we were just completely locked inside, I would wake up early, write for an hour. And at the end of that little section, the script was finished pretty much.
I'm curious, when you talk about diabetes in media, I think we all have a story or a movie, a TV show, a book, something that we look at and say, gosh, really? Like sometimes they get it right, but it's so minor. And sometimes they get it wrong and it's major. Is there anything that you have seen that you're just like, why?
Well, the one that really has stuck with me over the years is a episode of The Walking Dead. And it's so relevant to this film, it's almost embarrassing, but it's an episode of The Walking Dead where it's a type 1 diabetic and his sister. I mean, I don't actually really remember, so don't tweet at me if I'm wrong.
I remember.
You know what I'm talking about. Yeah, and he's dragging this cooler of insulin, and the good guy steals it and gives it back, and then I think they all get eaten by zombies.
Yeah,
but I
think she goes low, and they give her a shot.
Yeah, something like that. And I just remember thinking, I'm sorry, what? This is year 4 of the zombie apocalypse, and you're just dragging around a cooler of insulin? These MFers are dead. You're dead. You're dead. And I think everybody has this conversation, or a lot of people have this conversation, which, what would you do in the zombie apocalypse? I get in my car, I do this, I blah, blah, blah. And my answer is, I'm dying. I'm out. And people hate that answer. That really drives them crazy. No. And I'm like, no. I'm the guy who's going to buy you another 5 minutes by holding them off in the corridor. You know what I mean? Because I'm not surviving this stuff. And that is this other element of this whole movie is that experience, of really feeling like in media, like so often disabilities, type 1, but plenty of other disabilities are used as this sort of plot point where the person who is abled saves the disabled person and they're the hero and everything works out. And in reality, it's not that way because people with disabilities have to fight for themselves, right? In every single case, it's not abled people stepping up to the plate and saying, we're going to change this for you. We're going to do this for you. It's people with disabilities absolutely fighting tooth and nail for whatever they need to make their lives livable with the help of abled allies, right? Of course, they're not doing it on their own. There are people who are assisting them, but it really is the people with disabilities front and center. And so part of this film is also putting that in the middle of it as well. So it's not necessarily about somebody who is abled dragging a cooler of insulin through the forest. It's teamwork. It's two people working together to try and accomplish a goal. And the person with the disability is really in the center of the story.
So tell us about the Kickstarter. This launched, I think I saw you and I started talking when you were just shy of the goal. In the time it took us to set up this interview and talk to each other, you have exceeded the goal by more than, I think, twice. You're like 200% above it. Can you talk to me a little bit about what you actually are raising money for those of us maybe who don't really understand what needs to go into a movie? We know it costs a ton of money.
I've never made a movie before, so I'm learning as I go just how expensive everything is. You have to pay for all this really expensive specialized equipment. You have to pay for the use of a space. We're going to be shooting like outside of a city center where we live. So we have to rent hotel rooms and rent an Airbnb and ferry people in and out and pay for everybody's food. We have to compensate to the best of our ability everybody who's working on the film. And that's not to, include like professional actors like my wife or a director who could really command a fee like Anthony is doing all this for free and helping out with the Kickstarter on top of that. So it's an expensive process. And part of it is I feel such a massive responsibility to make this movie feel as polished and professional as possible so that everyone has to take it seriously. It doesn't just sort of get pegged as a disability piece, you know what I mean?
Right, yeah.
Because it's maybe as an excuse, it looks a little under production value. So I definitely feel a big responsibility to make it feel and look and read like a real professional film. And that is unfortunately very expensive.
Yeah. So, all right. One of the things that really got my attention was you did not only get the attention of the diabetes community with your social media campaign and the Kickstarter here, but of course, you got the attention of the Star Trek community. And it looks like they have been really generous. I mean, this is so embarrassing because, all right, I'll show my age. I'm a huge Star Trek fan, but I am a Next Generation fan. And it never kind of went from there. I started watching The Next Generation. Mostly, I watched it in high school. Then I watched it in syndication. I don't know if you know what that is.
I do. I'm not that young. Okay. I watched it in syndication too.
All right. So I watched it in syndication.
I know that Netflix used to send out DVDs. Right. It's okay.
Good. And then I got busy with life and kids and I missed all the other ones.
Missed DS9. You missed Voyager.
I know.
You missed all First Contact. My goodness. You've got a lot of catching up to do.
I did. I watched all the movies. In fact, we did a rewatch of all of the movies, including the original movies, like the first, with Kirk. We did it during COVID. We'll come back to that because I have some specific Star Trek questions for you. But let's talk about you and your wife. Now, you did not meet on Star Trek, right? You guys knew each other beforehand, and she was cast. Tell me the story.
Well, first off, let me say this, which is that, our director, Anthony Rapp, who's also on Star Trek Discovery, basically has been mentored by Jonathan Frakes, aka Riker. So there is a very strong connection to the Next Generation in this film, as Anthony sort of has been doing directing on Discovery.
Wait, is Anthony Rapp the same Anthony Rapp from Rent?
That's correct, the very same.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yes, we've got all of your favorite nostalgia picks all in one movie.
90s rewind.
Yeah. So Anthony, you would, of course, know him as Mark from Rent, but he's been in Dazed and Confused and Adventures in Babysitting. There is a direct connection to the Next Generation here. So it's not so far out of the realm to bring that up. Cool. But Mary and I met at Juilliard. We were both classmates there. And I was a big Star Trek fan. And she hadn't really, she, like everybody who grew up in the 90s and the early aughts, had watched some Next Generation, but that's kind of it. And she got an audition for Star Trek, and I was so excited, and I read the lines with her, and that was kind of it. She was supposed to do a slate, which is essentially just like a full body shot to see how tall you are. And she came in wearing this flowery, flowing dress, sort of a hippie dress. So I would normally never say anything, but this one time I said, "Look, sweetie, you look amazing, but you need to wear something with shoulder pads." And so she came back in a sort of military style jacket, and she got the part. So that's what I like. I like to say that she got the part because of that.
Oh, that's so funny.
And that was in 2017. And then she's just been working on the show, and I got a chance to work on the show as well. And yeah, it's just been a lot of fun for me. I hope she's having as much fun as I am, but I'm certainly having a good time.
Well, wait a second, but your mother is the biggest Star Trek fan, right?
This is true. Yes, my mother is, of course, having the most fun of all. Huh. Yes, she's gotten to go to conventions with me when I've been at conventions. She got to go on set and sit in the captain's chair. Great. She really has, she really has lived this wild Star Trek fan dream that she's very, very pleased with herself. And we're all very happy for her. And she's having the time of her life.
We haven't actually talked about your diabetes. How old were you when you were diagnosed?
I was 13. It was the summer between 8th grade and my freshman year of high school. Wow. So that was about 20 years ago.
What do you remember about it?
I remember just feeling I just remember all the classic symptoms, going to the bathroom all the time, being so thirsty, losing a ton of weight. And then my family doctor came into the office and said something to me, and my mom looked upset. So I was like, well, this isn't good. I don't know what he's talking about. This was sort of before diabetes was in the consciousness for everyone. It was like phase 1, phase 2 diabetes. Yeah. And then, I'm old enough to remember using NPH and having to eat on this crazy schedule when my long acting would kick in. And, it's funny because I stopped using a pump in 2011. But that pump that I had been using was pretty much the same pump since 2005. And so I'm like, I'm done with pumps. I'm out. I don't want to use them anymore. But then I'm like, oh man, like I'm still thinking about pumps like people think about the iPhone 5. Like
like the BlackBerry. Probably.
Yeah, I'm like I'm stuck in 2005 when it comes to a lot of that technology. So it's been a similar journey to many others.
Did you go on a pump or do you still use pens?
No, I still use pens, but I have graduated to using a Dexcom G6, so at least I'm not completely stuck in the past.
Well, the reason I'm asking is mostly because when I ask actors, I always like to know how or if they try to hide the technology. Because some of these outfits are pretty form-fitting.
When I was on Star Trek, I wasn't on the G6 yet. I was still using finger sticks. And for those who don't know, I was playing an alien, a blue alien called an Andorian. It was a full prosthetic face, right? So my entire face is covered in this thick layer of rubber. And one of my castmates, kind of the king of prosthetics, his name is Doug Jones. You would know him as the fish from The Shape of Water.
Oh, yeah.
He also wears prosthetics, and I had been on set with him a lot, and I'd see they put him in prosthetic hands. These kind of like goopy looking gloves, but you couldn't take them on and off. They were super fitted, so he would just sit there, you know, not being able to poke at his phone or do anything.
Ugh.
And when I got cast, I was so excited. I was thinking about the prosthetics, and I thought, oh crap, if they put me in these prosthetic gloves that I can't take on and off, I'm screwed. I'm going to have somebody take my blood sugar maybe on my forearm. Right. But if I'm wearing clothing that I can't roll up and down, like this is going to be a disaster. So I asked Mary and she said, well, just bring it up to the costume people and see what they can do for you. And the costume people, I sort of explained it to them and they sort of nodded and said, well, it's fine. We'll just put you in gloves the whole time. So the entire time of my sort of run of the show, I am wearing like black leather gloves, regardless of what I'm doing. I'm eating breakfast. I'm wearing black leather gloves. I'm flying a spaceship. I'm wearing black leather gloves. And that was just so I could have easy access to my fingers so I could test. So that's kind of a fun diabetes insider.
That is, because you know what that says? If we were talking to small children, or people who are wondering about how they're going to work at work or school, you can say, look, there's an accommodation to be made. Even this blue alien, they found a way.
Exactly.
But that's great. So I've already asked about your mom and Star Trek, and I hesitate, but I'm always curious to ask, being a parent of a child with type 1 diabetes, I'm always curious about other parents. And I know that when you're 13 or 14, you're not really paying attention to how your parents are going through something like that. But is there anything that they did when you were a teenager that helped?
When you're 13, you're still really a kid. You know what I mean? So it's hard to say like what they did that helped. They took me when I got diagnosed. We were going to go to London. And instead we went to a diabetes summer camp, which I absolutely loathed. I was utterly miserable. I was so unhappy. But I think it was very good for them. So I think that really helped them because they were totally freaked out. It was this huge job. There wasn't the resources available online.
Right.
So it was just like you kind of get thrown to the wolves back then. And it's sort of sink or swim. So I think that really helped them. And then the first semester or two of high school, I was just sort of like in and out of school. I would just like not go to school. And they were just sort of fine with that. And I think that was helpful just to take a couple of months to just get my bearing, understand what was going on. And I think for them, just having me around so that they also weren't worrying all the time.
Yeah.
And then I think it was also very helpful at some point. And of course, this changes person to person. Everybody, when it comes to this stuff, really needs different forms of help. But I think at some point, I just said, I am so sick of having you guys around. I'm so sick of being around you. I'm tired of you. And I'm 14, Yeah. So I'm taking control of this and I'm taking control of my life and I'll see you suckers later. And being okay with handing me the reins, is not an easy thing for any parent to do. And I think they just sort of let me go for it, and I think that was really useful and very smart because at the end of the day, it really is it is on the diabetic to take care of it as much as the parent would love to
Move
do
in
it
with
all.
you and never leave your side.
Exactly. And, of course, it's not the same for younger kids who really do need that different level of attention. But yeah, once you hit 14, you're going to hit some problems if you're really trying to not control, but have some control over your child's life, even if it is in the diabetes sphere. You're the one who's out there alone. You have to be able to handle it yourself. So feeling like your parents trusted you to be able to not die is a good vote of confidence.
You sound like my son. That's how he is. He's so blunt.
Yeah. Well, diabetes makes you kind of blunt because it is black and white, right? You get the stuff and you live, or you don't and you die. And that's sort of what the movie is about. As much as it is about disaster or access to insulin, it is also a very universal thing for diabetics, which can make some non-diabetics a little uncomfortable, which is a constant confrontation with mortality, right? You have the stuff, you live, you don't have the stuff, you die. There's not really wiggle room in there. And you kind of have to get comfortable with it, because otherwise you just are kind of woken up by it in the middle of the night and you start to panic. So you have to kind of make peace with it and look it in the eyes and just say, all right, this fact is coming with me and I can handle it.
Let's talk a little bit more about Star Trek. Gene Roddenberry's vision was very optimistic.
Sure.
Does that optimism hold up in this crazy time that we're living in? I'll answer. I'll say yes, because I think that's why people are still drawn to it and still love all the shows. But I'm curious what you think about this very optimistic atmosphere.
My experience interacting with most people, and I think this Kickstarter is a reflection of that, is that people want to be the best version of themselves. They want to be helpful. They want to lend aid where they can. And when asked to step up to the plate, most people do their best. I think that's my experience, is that there is a lot of stuff that gets in the way of that. But I just really think that most people want to help, and there aren't a lot of opportunities to help. Because the world is huge and our communities have sort of fractured, and for all sorts of reasons. But when I watch different shows or think about different shows, I actually think that the reason why Star Trek has stuck with so many people is it is a real reflection of how people try to be the best version of themselves, how they would like to interact with people, which is leading from a sense of cooperation, leading from wanting to be helpful, leading to problem solving. And just those simple things, cooperating with other people. Anybody who's worked at a job knows this. Cooperating is really challenging. Working alongside other people who come from a different background, have different ideas than you, is really challenging. Working together to solve a problem that doesn't have a clear answer, that people have different ideas about how to go about solving, is really, really challenging. And I think Star Trek is about, how do you navigate that, right? How do you navigate people who are trying to work together but are very, very different? I think that has been the most one-to-one reflection of my sort of adult experience, which is that people want to help, they want to be involved, they want to make the world a better place, but it's really, really hard to do. I don't know. I just think people don't want to live in a dark, gritty reality. It's cool to watch, don't get me wrong, but I think people really do strive to live in a community-orientated, bonded, connected society. And that is sort of the example that Star Trek offers. Less than a utopia. I don't think it's a utopia because there are so many issues, otherwise there wouldn't be any problems. And I don't think that Star Trek is offering a world where there are no problems. I think it's offering a world where the opportunity to solve conflicts, to solve interpersonal problems with quality communication, where a lot of the societal barriers have been removed. So it makes the focus less about how you're going to survive and more about how you can aid your community. I think that's sort of what people would really, really like. Most people I interact with anyway.
Yeah, well said. Very well said. So what's next for Type 1 the movie? I mean, as I said, you've already hit the Kickstarter goal. It'll wrap up pretty soon.
Mhm.
What comes next in the process?
Well, like once we sort of realized, okay, we're going to have enough money to make this movie, we've sort of kicked our pre-production into gear, hiring everybody who's not already on the team, finding the right location, getting all the logistics in order. And that will continue basically up until we shoot sometime in May. And then after May, it goes into post-production. And then if post-production goes smoothly, we'll go into the festival circuit. So yeah, it's really just trying to get the machine running for this project, which seems like a small little movie, but to do it right really does take a lot of, it takes all hands on deck.
And you're saying May of this year to start shooting?
Yeah, we got to move fast because people have to make other television shows.
Holy cow. Well, Noah, thank you so much for joining me, for sharing so much information. I'm thrilled that the Kickstarter has gone so well. And I hope that when you can breathe again, it sounds like you're going to be running nonstop for several months. Come back and tell us how it went and how we can continue to help.
Absolutely. I would love to be back. Thank you so much for having me.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
More information and that Kickstarter link, of course, over at diabetes-connections.com. If you're listening in a podcast app like Apple or Spotify, the links should be there too. Sometimes they don't work so well in those apps. So please head on over to the episode homepage every week to get the information at diabetes-connections.com. Yeah, it's really interesting with podcast apps how they're so easy to use, but the links don't often show up, especially with Apple, which is the top way people listen to this show is through the Apple Podcast app. But, the links are not so hot. So I always put it out there that you can head back to the homepage. I am going to tell you a little bit more about my Star Trek stuff. I alluded to it a little bit in the interview there, but how it ties into my former career in television. No, I was never on a Star Trek episode. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And when we first started with Dexcom back in December of 2013, the share and follow apps were not an option. They just hadn't come out with the technology yet. So trust me when I say using share and follow makes a big difference. I do think it's really important. I say this a lot. Talk to the person you're following or sharing with and get comfortable with how you want everyone to use the system. Even if you're following your young child, these are great conversations to have. At what numbers are you going to get in touch? How long will you wait before you call? That sort of thing. And that way, the whole system gives everyone real peace of mind. And I'll tell you what I love about Dexcom Share, and that is helping Benny with any issues using the data from the whole day and night, not just one moment. Internet connectivity is required to access the separate Dexcom Follow app. To learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. So I mentioned a little bit in the interview with Noah about how I love Star Trek: The Next Generation and how that's really where my fandom stopped, which is kind of embarrassing. I meant to watch Discovery before I talked to him, but I ran out of time and I've got to get Paramount or whatever the channel it's on. So we did watch season 1 of Picard. We did it with the free special, right? The free trial of that channel. Since the second season has just come out, I'll probably get Paramount and watch Discovery. I think that's where it is. Fingers crossed I've got it right. There's so much streaming. But back in the day, before streaming and just syndication, I used to watch Star Trek: The Next Generation. And I started watching it in high school. And I believe it was always in syndication, right? Wasn't it one of those weird shows that it didn't really have a network home? It was just syndicated. And it stayed in syndication forever, even after the series finished its run. So when I worked at WSTM, the NBC affiliate in Syracuse, New York, I used to go to bed very early because I had to be up. I had to be on the air at 5 o'clock in the morning. I don't even remember what time I got up to. It was even worse than radio because I had to put makeup on and, get dressed and look cute. I mean, I always got dressed for radio too, but you know what I mean? It's a little different. So I used to go to bed at 7:30 or 8 o'clock, and Star Trek: The Next Generation came on at 7. So I used to watch that most nights. And then when that was over, it was bedtime. And I got into that habit forever. And then I moved jobs and moved cities, and it just didn't last. And I never picked up on any of the other shows. I loved Picard. I thought they did a great job of kind of updating it and giving a lot of nods to the fans, but also having a really good time. And my husband is not as much of a Star Trek fan as I am, and he really liked Picard. And we also watched, as long as I'm giving you sci-fi recommendations, we watched The Expanse this year too. We started watching that last year, and that's on Amazon Prime. The Expanse is fabulous. The first season is pretty slow. I know. Get through it. Don't skip it, though. You need it for later on. But the first season is not the best. But it's a great show. It's 6 seasons. I loved it so much that when it was finished, I went back and read all the books. And the books are fantastic, too. Good stuff. Although, all right, now that I'm recommending pop culture stuff, I will say that The Expanse, especially in the early seasons and early books, is very male-centered. It's written by a couple of guys, so no surprise there. And when you watch The Next Generation, when you go back now with my eye now, those skirts are pretty short, and the female crew doesn't exactly get the best storylines. So if you're looking for sci-fi or fantasy that is just incredible and also happens to be a little bit more female-centered, N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth series, I read that last year. Absolutely phenomenal. Probably the best sci-fi or fantasy series I've read in ages. And I'm into that too. So I'll link all this up if you're interested. Join me for my new pop culture podcast. Stacey talks about sci-fi. You know what? That sounds kind of fun. All right, but that is not what this podcast is all about. Go check out Noah's Kickstarter. Next week, I am getting right back into the technology and tools of diabetes. We're talking with the folks from ViaCyte. This is the encapsulation of stem cells. This is the, quote, functional cure, way down the road for type 1. They were really interesting. There's a lot of new stuff that's been happening since I last talked about ViaCyte on the show. It's kind of beyond encapsulation now, what they're doing. Very much sci-fi feeling, if I could tie it back into that. But it really is interesting stuff, and I hope you can join me. All right. Thank you, as always, to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, are any of you expecting me to say live long and prosper? All right. Be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.